What I would like to do in this talk is to take up the theme of the citizen and life in a digital world by bringing about a link between the philosophy of technology and ethics and law of technology. I would actually like to focus there on what enlightenment could be by bringing the notion of enlightenment as it was developed in the work of Foucault towards this field. And I think it all comes from some kind of a discomfort that I sometimes feel with the way in which we have ethical discussions about ICT. Of course, there are big things at stake: privacy, security, autonomy, identity, what makes us human, what makes life in a digital age, right? But maybe all too often, the discussion is framed as if there would be this big opposition between technology on the one side of the room, as it were, and human beings on the other side of the room. And of course, that is a very fundamental distinction, a distinction that we often make in our thinking: humans and non-humans, subjects and objects, technologies invading the human sphere, and human beings have to be somehow protected against technologies. Still, I think technologies are already so deeply in our daily lives that we might need another model than this model, that maybe ethics and law should not only be ways to somehow protect humans against technologies, but rather means to live our lives in a better way with technologies. So the approach in philosophy of technology in which I am working is called the mediation approach, where we try to see technologies not as opposite to the human being, but rather as media for human existence, channels between human beings and the world, ways in which we live our lives, we understand the world, we do ethics, we have religious experiences even. And if you look from that perspective at ethics, I think the most interesting thing to do is to think ethics in technology, and to moralize technology, as one of my books is titled, where the objects around us have some kind of moral significance and the subjects around us are somehow technologically, morally mediated. Which also means that ethics cannot be an independent yardstick with which you assess technologies, but actually the yardsticks develop in interaction with technologies. So how could you do ethics of information technologies if you take this mediation approach into account? And I think there the notion of enlightenment of Michel Foucault pops up, because that's a completely different kind of enlightenment, which you could call an ethics from within technology, not an ethics from outside. Many people see Foucault as the philosopher of power, the philosopher of the panoptic society, where the power comes from outside and we need somehow to find subversive action to fight against Google, Apple, Microsoft and all those less than 10 companies that are overpowering us. So that's a dialectical reading of power. Power is against the human being. I think what Foucault did in his last books on ethics was actually try to see power as constitutive for what it means to be human, power as a source of being human. And he even spoke there about technologies of the self. Technologies help to make us human, and we should find techniques to interact with technologies to become better humans, as it were. And there he says enlightenment, if he wants to understand what that means in discussion with Kant, should not be seen as taking some kind of a critical position outside of the world of powers, also the powers of technology for our discussion, because there is no outside. We can only think in terms of the powers that are there. Powers have somehow made us into the beings that we are. So we have to stay within. We have to find a way of dealing with power. And that's what he calls a limit attitude. In an image you can say a critical attitude, another reading of enlightenment, places ethics or law outside of the realm of power. He says, the most far we can get is to stand at the limits of the situation in which we are. And at that limit, at that boundary, we can try to understand how we came to think the way we think, how we came to be the human beings that we are. That's a limit attitude. So not to position yourself outside of the field, but within the field and try to address, in our case, ethical, legal questions from within. So that's what I would like to do, quickly, in 3 steps. So first I would like to give you this, the basic ideas of this mediation theory. How can we understand human-technology relations, and how can that be a basis for doing ethics of information technology? Then I would like to take that into ethics. What does it imply for our ethical frameworks? And then to make the step towards digital enlightenment. What could such an ethics from within actually mean? And maybe I will have to cut it there somehow. So first, the mediation theory. So as I said, the basic idea of mediation theory is very simple. Human beings always have some kind of a relation with the world around them, and technologies are actually a medium between human beings and that world. We can even say there are 2 dimensions of that relation. Technologies help to shape how human beings are there in their world, how they act, how they behave, how they live their lives. And technologies mediate how the world can be there for human beings, how we perceive the world, how we interpret the world, how we experience things around us. North American philosopher Don Idy made even some kind of an analysis of various forms of that human-technology world relation. He says there are at least four shapes that it could take. Technologies can be embodied, a pair of glasses which you look through, not at. A thermometer which you read, a hermeneutic relation. It's more of a unity with the world, and you have a relation to the representation of the world that a thermometer or an ultrasound scan or an MRI scan gives of some element in reality. There's also an alterity relation, an interaction with a technology, with a robot, with an ATM, or a background relation. Technologies can be the context of our experiences, like the sound of the fridge that switches on and off at the background. We don't experience it, but it's just some kind of a background. Well, I think the interesting thing of new digital technologies, if we have to negotiate life in the digital world, is that they do not fit this framework anymore. For instance, take brain implants, deep brain stimulation, electrodes implanted in the brain to help people with Parkinson's disease or with very severe psychiatric disorders, and that tweak the functioning of the brain, etc. It's more than an embodiment relation, and it changes us. We are at stake in a completely new way. Persuasive technologies like this mirror, a persuasive mirror, that's to be placed in the waiting room of a medical doctor, and it morphs your face into what you will look in 5 years if you don't give up smoking or if you don't give up eating too much. They have an impact on us that's beyond the framework that I just discussed. Google Glass, just cancelled, but there will be a new one, no doubt. A completely new kind of relation where you actually have some kind of a bifurcation in your relation with the world. You experience the world through Google Glass. At the same time, there is this subtitle with the world giving you extra information about it. Recognizing the faces of people you meet on the street, giving information about them. Maybe our face, not our name, will be the key to information about us. Or digital technologies in the lab on a chip world. This is an example of a chip that's being designed at the university where I'm working myself in Twente, where the lab on a chip people are making a chip that can select sperm cells in X and Y chromosomes. It can separate the boys from the girls, and it gives us a very cheap tool in the future to select the sex of our children. What will that do? So new digital technologies which actually urge us to negotiate life in completely new ways in the digital world. New configurations beyond the ones that we just saw. A deep brain implantation is more intimate than an embodiment relation. It's some kind of a fusion. Persuasive technology is more interactive than a background relation. It's an interactive or an immersive background. Lab on a chip is even more intimate. It alters what it means to be a physical being. Google Glass is even more interactive than a persuasive environment. It has this bifurcation in our relation with the world. So mediation theory can help us to understand in which ways technologies put the human being at stake, in which ways they challenge us what it means to be human. And that can then be, I think, a very interesting starting point to ask legal, ethical questions about technology. So what does it imply for ethics? Well, I think the most important thing it implies for ethics is that we cannot see ethics as something independent from technology anymore. I have investigated this myself quite extensively in the field of obstetric ultrasound, where you can interestingly show that a lot of ethical questions and also a lot of ethical answers we give regarding Down syndrome, for instance, with unborn children are the product of the ways in which we now experience our unborn children through obstetric ultrasound. This reality of a fetus that we can see, our own child, not a child yet maybe, which we can see, is completely new. We never had that before. It does a lot of things. It separates the child from the body of the mother. In the early days, a doctor had to ask a mother what she felt, etc., to have some information about the baby. Now you see the baby on the screen, the mother has become the environment for the baby. And also, it medicalizes the fetus. The nape in the neck is an indication for the syndrome of Down, which then, of course, raises the question, do you really want to give birth to this child or not? Maybe not even in your own interest, but also in the interest of the child. Ethical questions are raised and also are helped to answer by technologies. For privacy, it's the same. If you look at historical discussions, for instance, a very interesting book by Bush about street lighting and the introduction of street lighting, you see very interesting discussions regarding privacy that mirror the discussion that we now have. When streetlights were introduced, of course, a realm that used to be private suddenly became public. At night, there were all kinds of things going on that we do on the internet now, sexual things, all kinds of business transactions that should not take place. And suddenly it was out in the open, and people really felt somehow stressed because of that. Of course, we found new ways of dealing with that, but we also came to define privacy in terms of the specific ways in which it was put at stake by these technologies. You see the same thing the other way round, maybe. If you use public buses or trains a lot, then you notice that people also have different experiences of their own privacy, their own private realm, and a public sphere. Maybe you recognize the experience of hearing somebody making a very intimate phone call just next to you, because for some reason the person they are speaking with over the phone feels more near than the person physically sitting or standing next to them, right? It reorganizes what you feel as private and public. So maybe we should take that into account. There is this moral significance in technology. And that's more than the technologies are moral instruments, and that we have a moral framework and we impose that on people using a technology. Of course, you can do that. And the famous example of very low-hanging overpasses over the parkways in New York, Long Island, so low that only cars can go below them, no buses. And in the days that they were built, there was this racist architect who built them. Black people could not afford a car, so they could not use those roads, they could not go to the beach, etc. That's moral instrumentalism. You have a moral framework, you impose it on people using a technology. There are also people who claim that technologies themselves can do ethics, that we can leave ethics to a computer, etc. It's also not what I try to claim here. I try to claim that any moral decision that we make is somehow technologically mediated. Technologies help to organize how we understand the world, how we interact with the world. Therefore, they help to shape our normative frameworks and even our normative actions. You can see that maybe better if you look at the level of intentionality, our intentions, our moral intention, what we want to do. So obstetric ultrasound, of course, mediates our intentions, but in the new technologies I just showed to you, well, the impact is even much deeper. A persuasive technology rather induces some kind of morality upon us. And of course we can find a critical relation, but it's harder because it's implicit. You just put your coat on the hook with a medical doctor and suddenly you see your face and you are forced, as it were, to take that perspective. In the case of a fusion, of course, it's much more invasive even. People with Parkinson's are cured in a sense a bit because their brains start to produce dopamine again if you have the implants. But dopamine also makes you feel good. And it might have the effect that people feel overcourageous, even manic sometimes. So they change in personality. So you can have an impact on who a person is by tweaking their brains. So what does this mean then for digital enlightenment? It means that our moral frameworks are not outside technology, but that they develop in interaction with technology. And an enlightened view of this, standing on the shoulders of Foucault, would mean that we don't try to place ourselves outside of that realm of powers, but accept this as a state of affairs. What privacy is for us, what's so important for us, is partly the product of technology, the technologies that put it at stake. And we have to deal with that. How to do that? What could such an ethics from within be then? So that's step 3. Maybe I will manage in time even. And so the limit attitude implied not placing ethics like we placed it in the picture on the left, but placing ethics as we put it in the picture on the right. From within, but at the limit. Try to stand at the limit in the sense that you don't try to say only yes or no. You have a framework in your hand and you say that's acceptable, that's not acceptable. But the question is rather how? How can we deal with this technology since we are in it already? And of course the ultimate answer to how can be not, right? But that's not the default option. It could be the final option. It also means that you try to see ethics not as assessing technologies from outside, but more as accompanying technologies from within, as it were. You don't try to stand outside of the field, but next to it. Try to address how technologies put specific normative frameworks at stake, how they raise normative issues, and how you can deal with them while these technologies are still under development. In using them in some kind of a critical way, by reading and tweaking the mediations. That is actually what Foucault calls a technology of the self, as I will say in a minute. Also in the design, value-sensitive design, it's an approach. It was, I think it started already 15 years ago or something. It never became big. It's starting to grow now. How can you design mediations into a technology? And also at the level of policy making. How can we govern the impact of mediations? How can we organize society in such a way that people learn to deal with it? Ultrasound is actually a very nice example of such a digital technology, where at least in my country, in the Netherlands, it was, I think 5 or 6 years ago, maybe longer ago, introduced halfway pregnancy, 20-week scan as some kind of a screening program for everybody. without a substantial discussion, without equipping people to deal with it. So, for instance, one of the effects that we see now is that there are ever fewer people with a hair lip born now in our country, which I find a very a big impact, actually, because we can repair such a thing quite well. But people are so stressed when they see their own child halfway pregnancy with a split head, basically. It looks much worse halfway pregnancy than when a child is born. And it's just before the final date that they can still choose to have an abortion, that they feel somehow forced towards an abortion. I think that's a good example of failing governance of mediation. So, quickly, how could we then equip people, designers, users, policymakers with this? So let me stand again on the shoulders of Foucault then. It was about the citizen, about negotiating life in the digital age. So for Foucault, there were four dimensions of the subject in relation to power. It looks complicated. I think it's less complicated than it looks. First, there is this substance, which he calls the moral substance. There's some part of ourselves that we try to let ethics get hold of. Our free will, our ability to make a balance between desirable and undesirable effects, etc. Some aspect of us that's the point of application. Then there's the subjectivation. How we make ourselves a subject by dealing with those powers. And what gives these powers the authority over? Why do we accept that? Is it a divine law in a book? Is it a rationally insightful principle, as Kant's ethics would be? There is some kind of authority there. Then third, it's something we do. We make ourselves into subjects by dealing with those moral codes. And fourth, there's always some kind of a goal, some kind of an ideal what we want to achieve, which you could call the good life here. If you translate it to technologies, it's our mediated existence, that's the substance. And the types of mediations are the authorities, and the forces exerted upon us. And we make ourselves in practices of the self, which you could call technological ascesis. An old word, which we typically associate with refraining from things, not doing things. But for Foucault, it's a technology of the self. It's accepting the powers that are there and try to shape them, and to co-shape them with a view of the good life. So let me quickly go through those four, and then I think I'll manage exactly in time. So first, the substance, our hybrid existence. Where do these mediations attach? What do they have an impact on? So for instance, the work that I'm currently doing tries to address this question from basically a very old framework, Kant's idea that in philosophy it's basically about three basic questions. What can I know? What should I do? And what may I hope for? Epistemology, knowledge, ethics, metaphysics, and also religion. Technologies help to shape how we understand the world, how we do ethics, even our religious frameworks, our metaphysical ideas. If we understand that better, we have a better idea of what technology is doing to us. Then the authority, the types of mediation. You can try to address in a more deep way where technology has an impact on us. It has an impact on our interpretations, on how the world becomes meaningful, and on our actions, as I showed. There are also types of impacts. Some impacts are coercive. A speed bump forces you to slow down if you drive near a school, as it were. Some are really decisive. It's an implicit effect. If you're in a building without an elevator and you have to take the stairs, something was left out, you don't see it, but it has a lot of impact on you. Some technologies try to persuade you, giving you feedback, seduce you, making it more attractive to do things. And there are all kinds of impacts that they can have. And there are also all kinds of interfaces between technology and us. And they can work on our senses, on our cognition, on the material infrastructure in which we live, and the realm of our ideas. Technologies work upon us from various angles. Dealing with those impacts on knowledge, ethics, and metaphysics, from all those impacts, can then happen in using technologies, shaping your life, negotiating your life in interaction with technologies, in designing technologies, by anticipating those mediations, assessing them, designing them into technologies, and also by governing them, trying to address issues of what a good way of living life with technology could be. And that's then the final thing, the teleology, freedom. If we want a free relation to technology, I think it's very important that we try to mitigate or to downsize our ambitions for autonomy. Because the idea of autonomy typically has the character of what you could call negative freedom with Berlin. Negative freedom is freedom from something. So you try to save something against technology. Positive freedom is freedom in order to do something, with a perspective, a teleological perspective. You are free in order to achieve something. And I think that's where digital enlightenment comes in. Accepting that we are in that technological realm, it doesn't make sense to be against technology, to somehow protect us continuously against technology. It means that we have to live a good life with technology, try to live with it, and of course we can conclude that we would not want it at some point. We can say no, but the basic question, I think, should be how. How to live life in a technological world. Answering that question is the central question, I think, for digital enlightenment. Thank you.